In the spring of 2019, in a county engineer's office in Garrett County, Colorado, a man with 2 degrees and a state seal on his business card told a 21-year-old woman that the land she had just inherited was worth less than the debt against it because it had no water, and never had. He was kind about it. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, a printout of the state's adjudicated rights for that stretch of the high plains, and her name was nowhere on it, and the creek that ran through her 1,100 acres was listed as a dry draw, ephemeral, unappropriated, dead. He called the property a sentimental liability. He used those words. He said it the way a doctor might tell you a thing you already half knew, with no malice in it at all, and that was somehow worse. 3 years later, in the fall of 2022, the same stretch of water carried a priority date older than the state's own paper, and the woman who had been told she owned nothing but dust held a decree in her hands that made her the senior right on the entire upper draw. Let me tell you about the years between those 2 afternoons, because the distance between them was not luck, and it was not a miracle. It was a dead man's handwriting, and a girl who refused to stop reading it. Her name was Wren Holloway. She was 21 the spring the land came to her, and she had grown up 400 miles away in a flat suburb where her mother had moved to get away from exactly this, from the wind and the debt and the long arithmetic of a place that gave back less than it took. Wren knew the ranch only from 3 childhood summers and from the man who had run it, her grandfather, Asa Holloway, who had died in February of that year at 84 with his boots by the door and a stock dog asleep on the porch. He left the 1,100 acres to Wren and to no one else, and the lawyer who read the will could not say why, except that the old man had been specific and had signed it twice. She was known, even that young, for 2 things. She was quiet in a way that made people repeat themselves, and she could read anything, any hand, any ledger, any faded column of figures, and tell you what it meant. She had been working toward an accounting degree she did not love. She drove west with everything she owned in a hatchback and a blue heeler named Tick riding shotgun, a dog her grandfather had kept and willed her as plainly as the land by name in the same sentence. Tick had ridden every fence on that place for 9 years. He knew the ground better than she did, and for the first month, she followed him. The first morning she woke in the old house, she did not know what a person was supposed to do with 1,100 acres. She made coffee in a percolator that had been her grandfather's, found the wood stove, found his coat still on its peg by the door, and went out onto the porch, into a wind that did not stop the whole time she stood there. Tick came off the boards and trotted out toward the draw the way a dog goes to a thing it means to show you, and stopped and looked back. She followed him down the slope through the gold grass to the lip of Cobb Creek, and she stood at the edge of 120 feet of cracked clay and old gray cottonwood snags, a winding, empty channel that the maps and the engineer and her own 2 eyes all agreed was dead. The dog walked out into the middle of it, into the dry bed, and lay down in a particular spot in the shade of a leaning snag, and would not be hurried, and she did not understand yet that he was lying where the water came. She thought he was just an old dog finding shade. She wrote in her phone that night, a list of things to sell, and the first item on the list was the ranch. The ranch sat in the rain shadow east of the Front Range, where the grass went gold by July, and the sky did most of the talking. 1,100 acres of short-grass rangeland, a sagging house, a barn with a good roof and a bad floor, and running through the middle of it a draw the maps called Cobb Creek, dry as a bone the day she arrived, a winding scar of cracked clay and old cottonwood snags. There was a well at the house that pulled hard and slow from somewhere deep, and there was the draw, and there was nothing else. No ditch, no headgate, no reservoir. In that country, land without water was not really land. It was a place to stand while you went broke. Which brings me to Dale Mercer, the man at the desk. He was the consulting water engineer. Half the county used, 51 years old, sharp and genuinely decent, with a master's in hydrology and 20 years of well logs in his head. He was not a villain in this story. I want to be plain about that early, because it matters. Mercer believed what the paper told him, and the paper was, as far as it went, correct. Wren had no adjudicated right. Cobb Creek had no decreed flow. The state's atlas showed the basin as fully appropriated downstream and dry up top, and a man who had spent his life trusting that atlas had no reason to doubt it for a girl from the suburbs, with a dog and a hatchback. He told her to sell. He told her a developer out of the city would pay enough to clear the note and walk away clean. He meant it as a mercy she did not sell. She thanked him, folded his printout into her coat, and drove the gravel back to the house. And that night she started reading the only thing her grandfather had left her besides the deed and the dog. It was a ledger. A thick one, canvas-bound, the spine cracked and the corners soft as cloth, and it sat where he had kept it, in the kitchen, on the shelf above the wood stove, under a tin of buttons. Let me tell you about that ledger, because it was the whole of the inheritance, and almost no one would have known how to read it. Asa Holloway had kept records the way some men pray daily and without expecting an audience. The book Wren opened that first night was the last of many, and it went back to 1961. But it referenced older ones, and it was written in the private shorthand of a man recording weather, water, cattle, and grass for himself alone. Most people would have seen chickens scratch and closed it. Wren saw columns. She saw a system. She had been reading her grandfather's hand on birthday cards her whole life, and within a week she could follow it, and within a month she could hear his voice in it, dry and exact, and what the ledger told her over and over, in entries going back 6 decades, was that Cobb Creek was not dead. It ran. It ran every spring from snowmelt off the divide, and it had run in some form every year of his life and his father's before him, and there were dates, hundreds of them, first water and last water, the day the draw filled and the day it went under, year after year after year. She sat at the kitchen table under the one hanging bulb, that first week with the book open and a legal pad beside it, and she did what she knew how to do, which was build a column out of someone else's notes. Down one side she put the year. Across the top she put first water, last water, days of flow, and a fourth column. Her grandfather kept that she did not understand at first, a single letter beside many of the spring entries, a small, careful H. It took her 4 nights to work out that the H stood for headgate, that on the days he wrote it he had walked down and set or cleared a notch of stone to turn the spring flow out across the bench grass below, and that he had done it the same week most years, the 2nd week of May, when the snowmelt came down off the divide. He was not describing a dead draw. He was describing a chore. A man does not keep a 60-year core log for a thing that does not exist. She filled 3 pages of the legal pad that week, and the pattern on it was as regular as a heartbeat. And she sat back and looked at it and understood before she had any of the law that the engineer with the seal had read the creek wrong. The man at the desk had told her the creek was ephemeral. Her grandfather's book told her it was seasonal, which is not the same thing, and the difference between those 2 words in water law is the difference between nothing And everything. Let me explain that, because the whole story turns on it, and it is not complicated once someone shows you. In the West, water does not belong to the land it crosses. It belongs to whoever first put it to beneficial use, and the date they started is their priority. First in time, first in right. A man who started watering crops in 1898 outranks a man who drilled a well in 1980. Even if the second man is richer, even if his well is deeper, even if the first man's ditch has been dry and forgotten for 50 years. The right does not die from disuse easily. It sleeps. And a sleeping senior right, if you can prove its birthday and prove it was used, can wake up and take its place at the very front of the line, ahead of everyone who assumed the line, started without it. The state's atlas showed Cobb Creek as unappropriated because no one living had filed the paper. Paper, though, is not the same as history, and history was sitting under a tin of buttons. Wren did not know any of this the first month. What she knew was that the book said the creek ran, and the engineer said it didn't, and that one of them was wrong, and that her grandfather had written down the truth every single day for 60 years, while the state had written its version once, from a county road in a dry July. She trusted the dead man. She had always trusted the dead man. So she started that first summer to do the only thing she could afford to do, which was watch the draw and write down what she saw in the same columns in a new book, continuing the record in her own hand, the way you would carry a fire from one room to another. Stay with me here, because the slow part is the part that matters. I know a girl reading a dead man's weather notes does not sound like much against an engineer with a seal. Keep watching. Anyway, let me tell you about the foil in this, a good man named Lonnie Pratt, because his road ran right alongside hers and ended somewhere very different. Pratt ranched the section just east of Wren. 4,000 acres his family had run for 3 generations, and when the dry years started to whisper, Lonnie did exactly what every expert told him to do. He went deep. He took Mercer's advice and the bank's money, and he drilled 2 new high-capacity wells into the Ogallala, the great fossil aquifer under that whole country, and he put in center pivots, those quarter-mile sprinkler arms that wheel across a field and turn brown ground green. It cost him close to $400,000, financed over 15 years, and for a season it looked like genius. His corners went emerald. His cattle fattened on irrigated grass while Wren's stood on gold. People drove by Pratt's pivots and then drove by Wren's dry draw. And they did the math everyone does, and the math said Lonnie was a rancher, and Wren was a girl playing in the dirt. Lonnie himself was not unkind to her. He came over the second week she was there with a casserole his wife had made and a 5-gallon can of diesel in case she ran short. And he stood in her yard with his hat in his hand and told her the way a neighbor tells you a true thing he wishes were not true, that the only ground worth anything in that country anymore was ground you could put a pivot on. And hers could not take one, no water under it worth chasing, and no decreed right to the creek to pull from. He told her about his new wells with the shy pride of a man who has bet big and watched the bet come in. 300 feet to good water, he said, and a pump that could throw 900 gallons a minute, and he said it standing in her yard, with the dry draw at his back, and he meant every word as kindness, and every word was a stone laid on the wrong foundation. She thanked him for the casserole. She did not argue. She had learned already that month that there was no profit in arguing with the whole county at once. Mercer came back out that second summer, not unkindly, to check on her, and he found her sitting on a camp stool in the draw with the dog and a notebook, measuring the width of a wet stain in the clay with the carpenter's tape. He stood at the lip of it, in clean boots, and watched her for a while. He told her gently that what she was doing had a name in his field, that they called it anecdotal, that a wet spot in June was not a water right and a grandfather's diary was not a decree. He called it folk wisdom. He said she was a smart young woman and over her head, and he said it as a compliment and a warning, both. She looked up at him from the stool and said one thing. He said, "The creek was here before the paper was." Then she went back to her tape, and after a while he left, and the dog watched his truck all the way to the county road. That was the second time the word was spoken over her work. A hobby the first time, folk wisdom the second. There would be a third. Let me tell you what she found in the ledger that changed it from a diary into a weapon. Deep in the 1961 book, Asa had copied forward an entry from a book older than himself, and he had marked it the way a man marks the one thing he wants remembered. It was a transcription in his careful hand of a notation his own grandfather had made, the first Halloway on that ground, a Welsh immigrant named Owen, who had come to the high plains in the 1892. The entry recorded that in the spring of 1898, Owen Halloway had dug a ditch off Cobb Creek and watered a field of oats and a kitchen garden and 40 head of cattle, and it gave the date, the 11th of May, and it described the head gate, a notch of stacked stone, first water put to beneficial use. May of 1898, a priority date. Asa had written something beside the copied entry, in the margin, in a hand a little shakier than the rest, the note of an old man who knew he was running out of the years to act, and was leaving the work to whoever came after. "Keep the date," he had written. "The date is the deed." Wren read that line 100 times that winter. She understood that her grandfather had known what he had known the creek carried a sleeping right worth more than the whole of the ground above it, and had never filed it, because filing it meant lawyers and money and trips to the city he did not have and did not trust, and because as long as no one downstream was short of water, it did not matter who stood first in a line, no one was waiting in. He had left her the date instead. He had left her the proof, and trusted her to know what it was. That was why the wheel had been so specific. He had not left her a dry ranch. He had left her the front of the line, folded into a ledger, waiting for the dry year that would make it worth waking. If it was true, and if it could be proven, then the Halloway right on Cobb Creek was not unappropriated. It was 8 decades senior to Lonnie Pratt's wells and senior to every other straw stuck in that basin. And it had been sleeping under a tin of buttons because the only people who knew it existed had been too busy ranching to file a piece of paper the state required. The trouble was that an entry in a dead man's book, copied from another dead man's book, was exactly the anecdote Mercer said it was. To wake the right, Wren needed proof on the ground. She needed the stone headgate. She needed Owen's ditch. She spent the back half of that second summer walking the draw with Tick and the 1961 ledger, looking for a notch of stacked stone in a creek bank that had been collapsing for 120 years. It is slow work, looking for a thing that wants to stay lost. The cottonwoods had moved. The channel had cut and filled and cut again. Her grandfather had given her a bearing in the book, though, so many paces below the bend where the old corral stood, and the old corral was still there. 4 cedar posts gone silver, and she paced it off the way he wrote it, and on an evening in August, with the light going long and amber, the dog stopped at a place in the bank and would not move. And she knelt in the dry clay and put her hand on a flat stone that did not belong to the river, and under it another, and under that the unmistakable squared shoulder of a thing that men had stacked on purpose a long time ago, to turn water where they wanted it to go. She had walked that stretch a dozen times before and seen nothing, because a thing buried in a bank does not announce itself. What she had not done before was pace it the way the book said, and dig where the dog stopped. She went down on her knees in the failing light and pulled the loose clay away with her bare hands, and the stones came clear one by one. 4 of them set in a line, and 2 laid across, dressed flat on their upstream faces the way a man dresses a stone he means to hold against moving water. It was the exact spot Tick had lain that first morning, the spot in the shade of the leaning snag, and she understood then that the dog had been showing her the water all along, that he lay where the spring flow came because that was where it had always come, and that her grandfather had trained 9 years of dogs to know the head gate, the way they knew the gate, to the corral. She did not shout. She sat down in the draw, and she cried a little, with her hand on the stone, and the dog leaned into her. And that was all. She had found Owen's head gate. The creek had a birthday, and now it had a body. Now, let me tell you about her grandson Skeptic, except it was not a grandson. It was a young man named Cole Brandt who showed up that fall, and I have to back up a little to bring him in. Cole was a water lawyer, 3 years out of school, working cheap for a firm in the city that took on basin cases, and he had been Wren's classmate's older brother, and the classmate had mentioned at a wedding that some girl they knew had inherited a dry ranch and gone strange about a creek. Cole drove out, expecting to talk a foolish young woman into selling before she lost more money. He arrived a skeptic, fully and openly, on Mercer's side of the ledger, without ever having met Mercer, because everything he had been trained in told him the same thing the Atlas did. Unappropriated, dry, done. She showed him the headgate. She showed him the 1961 book and the copied 1898 entry and the named witnesses. And Cole, who had read 100 case files, went quiet in a way he did not expect to. He told her, carefully, that it might be something, and that it would almost certainly be nothing, because proving a sleeping right meant proving continuous beneficial use across 120 years and 1 stone and 1 diary. He voiced every conventional objection the audience would have voiced. The right was abandoned. The records were hearsay. No court would reopen an adjudicated basin on the say-so of a notebook. He laid it all out, and it was all correct, and Wren listened to every word and then asked him a single question that turned him around over the following year more than any argument could have. She asked him why, if the creek was dead, her grandfather had written down the day it ran first water every spring for 60 years. Cole did not have an answer for that. A dead creek does not have a first water date. A dead creek does not have 60 years of them. The ledger was not sentiment. It was evidence, a continuous record of beneficial observation kept by the right holders themselves. The most boring and most unanswerable kind of proof there is. The kind that does not argue and does not exaggerate, and simply says, on this day, in this year, water ran here, and we used it, over and over, until the saying of it becomes a wall no expert can talk around. Cole took the 1961 book back to the city, and the older books that Wren found in a trunk in the barn that winter, 11 of them going back to 1908. And he began slowly to build a case he had driven out, fully intending to talk her out of. This is the part where I ask you to do one small thing. If you have ever watched someone be told they were foolish for trusting what they could see with their own eyes, think of them now. That is who this story is for. Now let me tell you what the weather did. The drought that everyone in that country still measures other droughts against arrived in the summer of 2021 and did not leave. It was the third dry year stacked on two others, and this one broke the back of the easy answer. Let me tell you what a drought does to a fossil aquifer, because this is the mechanism, and the mechanism is the whole reckoning. The Ogallala is not a river underground. It is ancient water, laid down over millions of years, and it does not refill at any speed that matters to a living person. Rain that falls on that short grass country mostly runs off or burns back into the sky before it ever reaches the deep water. So the aquifer takes in a fraction of an inch in a good year and gives up feet in a dry one. Every gallon Lonnie Pratt pulled up through his deep wells was a gallon that would not come back in 10 generations. In wet years, with everyone pumping at once, the water table fell slowly. In a drought with every pivot in the county running day and night because there was no rain to lean on, the table fell like a stone. Wells that hit water at 300 feet in 2019 were pulling air at 300 feet in 2021. The fix was to drill deeper, and deeper cost money. And the water you reached was worse, saltier, harder, and there was less of it, and it too was falling. That is the trap of the deep shore water. It is sure right up until the day the whole county reaches for it at once. And then it is the least sure thing in the world because no one owns the rate it falls and no one can make it stop. Lonnie Pratt drilled deeper twice. He chased the water down through the back half of 2021 and into 2022, and each time it cost more and bought him less. And the pivots that had made his corners emerald started cutting out mid-rotation when the wells could not keep up, and the green went to stripe. His note came due the same as ever. The bank does not care why the aquifer fell. By the late summer of 2022, Lonnie Pratt was selling cows he had meant to keep and doing the arithmetic that ends with a sign at the end of a driveway. And I want to be clear that there was nothing foolish about Lonnie. He did what the experts said, he did what the bank financed, and what Mercer drew up, and what 3 generations of good sense said to do in a dry country, which is dig down to the deep shore water. The deep shore water was neither. That was the lesson the whole county learned at once, and learned hard. He came over to her place again near the end of that summer, and it was a different man in the yard than the one who had brought the casserole 2 years before. He stood with his hat in his hands again, and this time he had come to ask whether her creek truly ran, because he had heard she was claiming it did, and he had 800 head he could not water and a second mortgage on land his grandfather had broken. She did not gloat. And she walked him down to the draw and showed him the thin, clean thread of snowmelt moving over the gravel where the old headgate turned it. Water you could hear, water you could put your hand in, while 9 miles of dead pivots stood baking behind him to the east. He crouched at the edge of it and looked at it for a long time, and did not say anything, and the dog came and sat beside him, and the two of them watched the water the way men watch a fire. Then Lonnie stood up and said the only thing there was to say, which was that he had been wrong about her, and that his grandfather would have known this creek, and that somewhere along the way the family had stopped reading the ground and started reading the bank. She told him the water was there if he needed it. She meant it, and a season later she made good on it. Cobb Creek, meanwhile, ran. It ran less in those dry springs, but it ran, because snowmelt off the divide does not care about the aquifer, and it filled Owen's old channel every May the way the ledger said it would. 1,100 acres of short grass that needed no pivot, because it had never been asked to be anything but what it was. Wren ran fewer cattle than Pratt, and she ran them on grass and creek water, and she carried almost no debt, because she had not borrowed against a future the weather refused to deliver. She was not prospering. Let me be honest about that. She was surviving, narrowly, on gold grass and a thin spring flow, while better-financed men went under all around her. Surviving, though, in 2022 in that county was its own kind of fortune, and people began to notice which ground still had water moving across it when the wells gave out. Cole filed the claim in the spring of 2022. It was a petition to confirm a senior right on Cobb Creek with a priority date of May 1898, based on continuous beneficial use, supported by 11 volumes of contemporaneous ranch records, the physical evidence of the original stone headgate, and Wren's own continued use of the creek for stock water. The basin's other right holders objected, as they had to, because the senior right waking up at the top of the draw meant everyone below moved back, a place in line in the worst water year anyone could remember. Mercer was retained as the expert witness against her. He did not do it out of spite. He did it because he genuinely believed she was wrong, and because being the man who knew that basin was who he was, and a stone in a creek and a stack of diaries had not yet changed his mind. The hearing was in October in the district water court, 2 counties over, in a plain room with bad light and a long history of deciding exactly this kind of thing. Let me tell you how a water court weighs a sleeping right, because it is not how you would expect. It does not ask who is sympathetic. It does not ask who is rich or who is young or who has a degree. It asks 2 questions, and only 2. When did the water first get put to use, and has that use continued? Everything else is noise. Wren's case was 11 volumes of the most patient evidence imaginable, kept daily, decade over decade, by people who had no idea they were keeping it for a courtroom. Mercer's case was the state atlas and his professional opinion that the records were anecdotal. He testified first. He was good on the stand, calm and clear, and he said the word for the 3rd time, the word that had followed Wren's work from the first afternoon at his desk. He called the ledger's folklore. He said under oath that a family's private diary, however charming, was not a hydrological record, and that the court should not reopen a settled basin on sentiment. It was the 3rd time the dismissive label was spoken aloud over her grandfather's book, and it was spoken, like the first 2, by a sincere man who was about to be corrected not by an argument, but by the thing itself. Then Cole put the senior water referee through the records. He did not make a speech. He simply walked the old man who had judged water in that district for 30 years, through the entries, 1 volume at a time, First Water and Last Water, 1908, 1912, 1931, through the dust years when the entries grew thin and desperate but never stopped. 1954, 1977, every drought the century had thrown at that ground and the creek's behavior in each. Written down the day it happened by the people who used it. He laid the 11 volumes out on the long table in order, oldest to newest, and he had Wren's 3 legal pads beside them, the columns she had built, year and first, water and last water, and the small, careful H for headgate. And he showed the referee how the girl's modern record continued the dead man's without a gap. The same hand of attention, if not the same hand of writing, carried across the very year the engineers said the creek had no existence at all. And then the photographs of the stone headgate and the surveyor's confirmation that it sat exactly where in 1892's appropriator would have placed it to water the field, the 1898 entry described, the dressed faces turned upstream, the line of it pointing straight at the bench grass below. The referee, who had seen every trick in basin law, asked one question when Cole was done. He asked Mercer from the bench whether the engineer had ever in his career seen a continuous daily record of a creek that did not exist. Mercer was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "No." He said, "I have not." The decree came down 3 weeks later, in November of 2022, and it confirmed the Halloway right on Cobb Creek with a priority date of May 11, 1898, senior to every other appropriation in the Upper Basin. The senior right on 9 miles of water. A girl who had been told she owned dust, holding the oldest claim on the only thing in that country that mattered. The number that landed hardest was not a dollar figure, though the dollar figures came later, the lease offers, and the dry year value of senior water. In a basin running on empty sums that would have made the developer Mercer once mentioned, the number that landed hardest was the date, May 11, 1898. 124 years asleep, written down the day it began by a Welshman with a stone and a shovel, carried forward in his grandson's hand and his great-great-granddaughter's after that, and read at last into a court record by a young lawyer who had come to talk her out of it. The room was very quiet when the referee read the date. Mercer, who was a decent man, sat with the state atlas closed on the table in front of him, and after the hearing he did a thing that tells you everything about why this story is not a story about a villain. He found Wren in the hallway, and he asked her if he could see the ledgers, not to challenge them, to learn them. He said he had been reading that basin from the top down his whole life, from the atlas to the ground, and he had never once thought to read it the other way, from the ground up, from the people who had their hands in the water. He asked if she would teach him to read her grandfather's hand, and she did. Let me tell you what she did with it, because the measure of the woman is in the after. She did not scale up. She did not sell the senior right to the highest straw downstream and walk away rich, though she could have. She leased a portion of the dry year flow at fair terms to the neighbors whose wells had failed, Lonnie Pratt first among them, and she did it at a price that kept his ground and his family, and the two of them, the survivor and the one who nearly went under, ran water down the old draw together the following spring. She kept the operation the size the creek could carry, and no larger. 1,100 acres, and a senior right, and a thin, sure flow. Because the whole lesson of the thing was that the land had told the truth about its own size for 120 years, and only the people had argued with it. Cole Brandt did not go back to the city firm. He moved his practice out to the county, and he made a kind of specialty of sleeping rights, of the old records gathering dust in ranch kitchens all over the high plains, and more than one family kept their water because a young lawyer learned from a girl and a ledger to ask why a dead creek had a first water date. Mercer learned the old hand. He spent a winter at Wren's kitchen table with the 11 volumes and a magnifying glass, and he came to say to anyone who would listen that the most accurate hydrological record in that basin had been kept by men with no degree at all, daily, for free, for 100 years, and that the profession would do well to go looking for the others before they were thrown out with the buttons. Here is the thing. The whole story was always about, said plainly now that you have seen it work. There are two kinds of knowing in this world. There is the kind that comes down from above, wide and confident and credentialed, that reads the land from a road and an atlas and a state seal, and is right about almost everything and wrong about the one thing that turns out to matter. And there is the kind that comes up from below, narrow and slow and patient, that reads the land from the inside. From 60 years of first water dates and a stone you find with your hands in the failing light, and knows the one thing the atlas missed because it was there every single day to see it. The first kind builds the maps, the second kind keeps the water, A system measures what is easy to count, and a deed is easy to count, and a well log is easy to count, and a state atlas is easy to count, and none of them counted the creek. The ledger counted the creek. What is written down with love every day for 100 years is stronger than what is written down once with authority, because the world is not an atlas, and the water does not run where the paper says. It runs where it has always run. Wren Holloway still has the ledger. It sits in the kitchen, on the shelf above the wood stove where her grandfather kept it, and the newest volume in the stack is in her hand now. First water and last water the day the draw fills, and the day it goes under, carried forward. On the porch in the late light, an old blue heeler, too stiff to ride fences any more, lies in the last warm square of sun, the way he lay the day she came. And when the creek runs in May, you can hear it from the steps. The man with the seal was not wrong about the paper. He was only wrong about the water. And the water, it turned out, had been hers all along,